Hey, this is Lewis from Breakdance, and in this video, I'm going to show you the new grid element coming in Breakdance 1.4. Breakdance 1.4 is currently available in beta, and we're going to ship 1.4 final rather soon. So we shipped 1.2 in January, and then we waited until the end of May to ship 1.3, so almost 5 months. And that's because 1.3 was a monster release. I mean, we've got like 20-something new features in this release. Anyway, going forward, for the most part, we're going to be doing smaller, more frequent releases. So that's the point of 1.4. We shipped 1.3 again May 31st, and we're shipping the beta of 1.4 a week later. We'll probably have 1.4 final out 2 to 3 weeks from now. We're not putting much in it, just a new grid element. So I'll show you that, but first I want to talk about what it is and what it isn't. So there are 2 requests on the feature request board. There's one for a grid element. This is for a very simple grid element. It's like columns, but multiple lines, not full-blown CSS grid. That's what this is. There's another request for CSS grid controls that is not coming in 1.4. That is the full-blown CSS grid layout controls, so you can do anything with CSS grid. 90% of the time you don't need that, and you're going to end up using the grid element. That's what this is. So let's take a look, and let's see when you'd want to use this instead of columns. So let's take a look at the element. You just go to Add, and then add in a grid. And you then have your grid controls. You have items per row, which is responsive and pre-filled for you. And of course, you can just clear that out with the indicator dot. You have space between items, which by default use the default column gap. And then you have advanced controls to control the item vertical alignment, item horizontal alignment, and whether to use the original item dimensions. Generally, you won't need this. Okay, we have the grid. We have 4 items per row. Let's go ahead and throw in an icon box, and let's just do Command-C and Command-V to paste that 4 times. And there we go. You have 4 in the row. Let's keep pasting, and we now have a 4x3 grid of icon boxes. If we want to make that 3 items per row, we just go like this, and it's now 3 items per row. We can change the space between items like this, or just leave it on the default. And this is responsive, so we can go down smaller. We could say we got 2 items per row there, and then we could say still 2 items per row there, and then we go 1 there. So that's the general idea of this element. Create a very basic grid very, very easily. You'd want to use this instead of columns in certain instances. The most common one being, let's say you want to do a 3x2 or 3x3 grid, but it then goes 2 columns on a mobile device, just like this one. Well, let's see what that would happen if you tried to use columns for that in Breakdance. So if you do 3 columns, and then you add your icon box in each column, then you duplicated this columns, 1, you'd have to add spacing here to get the same amount as what you put there. And 2, this isn't going to work on responsive, and here's why. Let's say I made these columns stacked vertically on phone portrait, but then 50% width on tablet landscape. And let's copy and then paste the design to this other element. Let's add that margin back in. Well, if I did that and then I go responsive, we have 2 per row, but because there are only 3 columns here, this element can't magically jump into the other columns element. That's why you'd want to use grid. If you were to do this with the grid element, and you set 3 items per row, and add it in your icon boxes. 1, you wouldn't need to use 2 columns, and 2, when it goes down to 2 items per row, it works. There's no gap. So that is the basic grid element. Now I'll show the advanced controls, which you're very rarely going to need. So let's just throw in a small element in this grid, and let's also throw in a bigger element in the grid. And let's go like this. Let's go back to the grid, and we go to advanced. We see item vertical alignment, center and start and stretch. That would make this thing as tall as it is. It obviously is not going to stretch the icon inside, but if we don't choose that, you can see what it's doing. Item horizontal alignment, same idea. Start, center, end, or stretch, and then use original item, or here we can go start there, and you can see what it's doing there. If it's stretched, it's going to be the full size. You can see the outline. And then use original item dimensions. That is to prevent problems when the element is bigger than the grid is. So for example, here we have an image, and we could say the image is 1,000 pixels wide. Well, if we have 4 items per row on this grid, obviously the image can't be 1,000 pixels wide. If we enable use original item dimensions, it uses the original dimensions. Why is it not 1,000 pixels wide? Because of the way the image element in the grid works, but this just means the grid isn't overwriting the pixel value you set in the element. Generally, when you're using grid, you shouldn't be setting pixel value anyway. Just let the grid take care of the width. Anyway, that is the basic grid element. There's some other new stuff in Breakdance 1.4 as well, and by new, I mean polish and fixes. This is the only new feature in Breakdance 1.4, so we're going to be able to get this tested and out the door very, very quickly. Probably ship this thing in, 2 to 3 weeks from now, and that'll be plenty of time to get everything tested and polished because, again, this is a very small, straight-to-the-point release. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and let me know your thoughts.